skills. We're looking at, behavior, activities of daily living. We're looking at social skills. Now, for goals, the data noted in the present levels is used to support and write the IEP goals. Now, optimally, your district should be using SMART goals. So we're talking about specific, measurable, achievable. Okay. We have to make sure that they are reasonable and they are time bound. Those goals should be written in the sense that what can this student accomplish over the course of the year? Okay. We're not fast forwarding out. We're saying what can they accomplish between now and the end of the year. Now, a SMART goal example would be like Quinn will read, how about by the end of the second marking period, Quinn will read a series of 5 high frequency sight words with 90% accuracy. All right. That addresses all of the issues within the SMART goal itself. All right. We're going to look at services. Those are your related services like speech, OT, PT, any type of, counseling support. Those services are going to be based on whatever supports were dictated by the needs that were noted in the present levels. And then we have progress monitoring. This is so critical because it ensures that you're measuring growth in these particular skills over the course of the year. And you'll see why this becomes even more important later on. Now, districts are being challenged because students are not making meaningful progress. So what you want to do basically is you want to make sure you have your baseline data in place, you have your measurable goals, you're monitoring progress, and if no progress is being made, you're making database adjustments as necessary. So consider, do you know what methods that your teachers are using to progress monitor? And you can unmute and just let us know. Any thoughts? Maybe you want to just put them in the chat.
While we're doing that, I just want to remind everyone, this session is being recorded, and the recording of this session will be posted on the SAANYS website under professional learning, and the slides will be available as they are embedded in the recording. Just want to remind people of that. So the session is being recorded.
Okay, so Todd, you mentioned curriculum-based measures. Excellent. Any other forms of progress monitoring being used?
We use universal screeners as well as end of unit, some of the curriculum, the end of unit assessments.
Okay, great. I think it's important that you have an understanding administratively what's being utilized in your district, so you can have that conversation with parents, should it arise. All right. Yeah. And let me get the next slide up. Okay, some common IEP failure points, and these occur on a process or a content level, and the importance for you knowing about them as administrators is because they are key aspects in a hearing. So from a process perspective, we'll look at timelines. Did you miss a 60-day timeline from parental consent for the initial eval to the completion of the evaluations and the IEP meeting? All right. In New York State, it's 60 days. It happens to be 60 calendar days. In other states, it may be school days. What about your team composition? Were all the required members of the team at the meeting? Did you allow parents to participate in meetings? I have, heard stories of parents saying they went to their child's CSE meeting, but they really weren't asked any questions. They didn't feel like they had the opportunity to participate and provide input. Was the student there where it's appropriate? Now, there are parents who may request that their child be a participant at the meeting because they want their child to understand just what the process is. Student participation is definitely indicated when a student is of age, 16 and over, or depending upon their unique circumstance, it might be a little younger during transition meetings. Okay, so if we're looking at data, that's something that's going to be investigated. And failure to provide procedural safeguards. From a content area, we're looking at weak present levels of performance. Maybe they didn't accurately describe a student's current levels in terms of their academics, in terms of their speech and language skills, in terms of their behavioral skills, anything along those lines. So if they're not actually representative of where the student is functioning at this current time, it could be problematic. Maybe the goals are misaligned. Maybe they don't match the areas of need that you have noted in the present levels. Or maybe you've made inappropriate recommendations regarding the LRE. And that was the case in a prior student that I had, that they couldn't justify why an out-of-district recommendation was truly being recommended. Now, the failure to include behavioral notations pertaining to instruction is, did you make it clear that this student's behaviors is truly impacting their academics? And note the behaviors don't have to be acting out behaviors. They can be, lack of motivation or failure to complete work or truancy. And again, do you have the baseline data to determine goals? Mhm. Now, the C is we're looking at compliance through a leadership structural model. Now, the structure precedes compliance because it clarifies who's responsible for different aspects of the IEP implementation in case um, issues arise, or you want to make sure that you have, coordinated leadership to address any particular concerns. It also ensures systems that support service delivery, like staffing, like instruction, and it also strengthens compliance aspects and accurate reporting to state and federal agencies. So consider that we have three aspects to this structural model. We have the legal, we have the operational infrastructure, which looks at the fiscal data and staffing, and we have the instructional delivery. Now, as I go through these, what I really want you to think about is which administrators in my district, okay, would be responsible for overseeing each of these levels. Now, legal is the first level on the pyramid. Now, we reviewed these prior, but consider who's going to be responsible for compliance and procedural oversight. The next level is our operational system, okay? And we're going to start off with data. And I want you to think of the district's data system as an online filing cabinet, right? It has to be organized, it has to be searchable, it has to be continually updated to maintain data accuracy and to avoid reporting errors that could jeopardize compliance under IDEA. Now, you operate with an integrated platform, whether you have your Power School or Infinite Campus, that is your student management system, all right? And special education operates within the frontline system. And those two systems have to work together so that information entered at the building level accurately reflects what's happening for students. Now, these systems also store critical information such as your academic performance data, your discipline data, your testing data, your IEP documentation. So because this information feeds district, state, and federal levels, the accuracy of the data is critical. So for example, if students are in full day special classes, but they're not given opportunities to be included in general ed specials because that's how we've always done it here. Okay, once the data is displayed, it may show that those students are in special ed in general education classes for less than 40% of the day, which can raise compliance concerns under the LRE indicator, depending upon your numbers. I had a situation where, I became aware of principals who were amending on their own students' course schedules because they wanted to equalize out enrollments in other classes. So they were just changing students around. So they may have placed a student in a class that had a TA, but the student's IEP was reading that they should have been in an integrated co-teaching class. All right. So when the director of special ed needs to try and reconcile their numbers, okay, in order to certify data, it becomes problematic on many levels. One, because we're not meeting the student's IEP, but also because these numbers are not matching up data-wise. So data accuracy is not simply a clerical task, it has repercussions. Now, staffing is another level in the operational system. Now, from a systems and operational perspective, staffing oversight, I think, is one of the most critical responsibilities that school leaders, hold in terms of IEP implementation. We're looking at master scheduling. You need to align the schedules with required service minutes. You have to coordinate provider availability and instructional settings with regard to caseload management. Are we managing manageable caseloads for teachers and related service providers? Are we ensuring the capacity to deliver services and monitor progress? Now, with regard to service logs and related services, we need to verify that services are actually being delivered as they're written on the IEP. Okay, not that services have been cut back at all, not that the providers have made other arrangements, but are they being carried out with fidelity as indicated on the IEP? And we have to monitor documentation for any gaps in that service delivery. And that also becomes a significant issue. So consider at a CSC meeting, all right, a parent comes in and questions the counselor's provision of services for their child. And they request that the provision of service logs because they want to see exactly when their child was receiving that support and what actually occurred during that session. They just want to get a sense, does this match up to the IEP? Because their child's coming home and saying, you know what, I haven't seen Miss Smith today, for example, for counseling. And the mother gets concerned because this is slowly starting to build up. So the counselor says she requested at a meeting, and the counselor says, well, I'll get it to you next week. The parent says, no, I really would like to see it now or definitely by the end of the CSC meeting. And if that information isn't on hand to be able to show the parent, then that becomes problematic. And not only that, you risk breaking trust with families, right? Because essentially that IEP is your commitment to the families that you're going to be providing services as written. Staffing shortages and coverages. We need to plan for provider shortages through scheduling, whether you're contracting out, whether you're sharing services with another district. And we have to make sure that coverage or makeup services, with providers are available, that we've been able to cover for that. But I think we're all aware of the fact that nationwide shortage of special ed teachers and related service providers requires really some thoughtful planning and kind of thinking outside of the box. Um, whether we're looking at, bringing in retirees, whether we're looking at any kind of remote services, or we're looking at different models for delivery. So I'm just going to, I'm going to ask how many of you, have had difficulties with shortages? How have you managed it? And have any of you ever used the 311 model for service delivery? Any thoughts? Maybe you haven't had any difficulties at all with regard to providing absentee services.
What is the 311 model?
Okay. The 311 model actually came out through the American Speech and Hearing Association, and they have a write-up of it online. And basically what it says is that we're going to provide services 3 weeks out of the month, and the following week, okay, is going to be allocated for consulting, for evaluations, for attending meetings, for paperwork issues, for maybe, direct, indirect consultations. And when you write it up, you write it up based on the minutes of services over the course of the month. All right. And I know there are districts that are utilizing it, not only for, speech services, but for all other related services. And Jessica says you're using the 3-1 model, but you're at tone. Oh, interesting. Jessica, can you explain why the attorney told us that you shouldn't?
I, I'm not really sure. I think we had an attorney who was really particular, and so it was on the IP, the 3-to-1 model, and we were putting services down as monthly, and they just told us we weren't allowed to reflect it that way. So they made us move away from the 3-to-1 model, and then we moved to just having 4 hours a week of just collaboration time. So now the services are written weekly versus monthly, but it was something to do with the way that they were written on the IP. He didn't feel like we could have them that way.
Okay, did you write it in terms of minutes of service over the course of the month?
No, we did like 6 times a month, so it was monthly. And that might have been the issue because you were talking about minutes per month.
Right. Right. Okay. I know that's how another district has been writing it up, and they haven't had any difficulties with that. So it could be just the way that it was implemented.
Okay, well, thank you.
Sure. Now, I think the importance when it comes to service delivery is also maintaining written documentation and communication with parents. If you're finding that you can't meet the services as they're indicated online, maybe you have, a related service provider that's going to be out for a month, for 2 months, or maybe you're just having some inconsistencies with the provider with regard to, service provisions, or you're having an increase in the number of students and you can't meet the needs of all your students. It's critical that you maintain documentation and that you maintain communication with the parent because chances are compensatory services are going to be indicated, and the saying is, if it wasn't written, it didn't happen. If it wasn't written, it wasn't said. All right. So keep documentation. Note, I called the parents on this date. I told them what the situation was. I let them know there were also advertising in such and such paper, for supports. And you're keeping track so that you know when compensatory services can be applied. Mhm. Does
Joanne, let's take a look a minute
Sure.
at Kristen's comment. She said TAs willing to go to different buildings when students are absent. That's interesting. That doesn't happen everywhere. Because I think Joanne was asking, about what we might call the morning scramble for coverage when
Mm-hmm.
TAs are absent and you are really, really scrambling. Not just do you have a full deck of providers, technically,
Mm-hmm.
particularly special ed teachers, but just, in the morning, the coverage issues that come up can be really, really challenging. So I just wondered maybe Kristen can tell us a little bit about, is that just kind of the culture in the district that TAs are willing to, move around as needed, building to building, or was there some kind of built-in expectation when they were hired? How does that work?
Well, it's sort of, I mean, it's just become sort of a
Yeah.
desperation at this time. I mean, we have, buildings with, you know, a dozen staff shortage.
Uh,
And we're a little bit unique because we are in a BOCES, so we have, our special education schools within the organization. So, if there's students who are out and, say they're a one-on-one, then we and another school is, really scrambling.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like that's what we've started. Like, would you be willing to go to blank school? And really it's, just trying to most everybody is amenable to that and just really trying to help each other out and know that, if
Thank you.
tables were turned,
Mm-hmm.
right, hopefully somebody else would do the same for you. But it's tough.
It
It
is
is.
tough. That's an interesting way, though, of managing it. And you're fortunate that you have TAs that are willing to accommodate for that in that way. Because that's also problematic, if you're in a smaller district. I know I was a principal in a small district. I had to cover two buildings. They were about 10 miles apart. And so I was back and forth between both, and coverage was difficult. And I know there were times when even portions of the day I had to cover a class. So I know that that becomes a difficult decision. But then I think when we're looking at staffing, we're looking at services, and I think that's also a reason why, related services providers, and I know I've seen it done with speech, OT, and PT, where you create criteria for providing services. Entry, exit criteria is what constitutes twice a week, 3 times a week, 4 times a week, something along those lines, so that everybody has an understanding. And also, the understanding that sometimes, we just have to cut back on what's termed, like speech improvement services, for example. Maybe we can't see that student, once a week for supports. And that also can have challenges because parents may say, and I've had them say, we pay your salaries, we pay taxes to this district. My child should get speech therapy, but sometimes our services have to go to our students first that are classified and have IEPs that are mandating that support. before we provide like a non-mandated support. So a lot of, considerations along those lines. Okay, the other area under the operational system would be fiscal, and naturally that's going to be your school business official. All right. Now, they truly play a critical role in ensuring that the financial structures supporting special ed services are aligned with the requirements on the student's IEPs because every service on that IEP has a financial commitment. Now, because reimbursement and funding are tied to documentation, accurate service logs are essential because those records not only confirm that services are being delivered as required, but they also support the district's ability to recover allowable costs where indicated, like in Medicaid tracking, of special education services. Now, when documentation is incomplete or services aren't delivered as written, districts may lose reimbursement opportunities, which definitely increases their financial exposure. Now, I believe the last calculation placed on the state's funding of IDA was at 11%, which is a far cry from the 40% initially promised. So the impact financially for finding funds to provide for students is definitely an issue. Now, services identified in an IEP, they can't be denied and they can't be reduced due to cost considerations because that exposes the district to legal challenges. So your school business official really is a key partner in ensuring that fiscal planning, that documentation systems, that resource allocations really support the district's legal obligations of IEP implementation. Now let's look at the top level of the peer, and that's our instructional level. Okay. So the director of curriculum instruction really ensures that curriculum, teaching practices, professional development, that's a district support. All right. And they're looking to support the successful implementation of students with IEPs. And they help teachers deliver instruction that meets both the academic standards as well as the students' individual needs, like aligning the curriculum with their IEP goals, like providing systems for tracking student progress, or maybe collaborating with special ed teams on the IEP. So, in a sense, what they're doing is they're making sure that the IEP becomes a meaningful instructional tool rather than simply a compliance document. Now, the visual of the pyramid shows how any problem at one level could very well impact another. So, if there's a due process issue, which would be at the first level of the pyramid, it could very well affect the budget, which is the second level. If there's a staffing issue, which is the second level, that can impact instruction at the top, but it also impacts the budget. So, consider this to be more or less like a holistic look at the system. And there's another way to view your IEPs. And that's viewing it through the lens of state alignment. All right. The portrait of a graduate essentially establishes what success should look like for all learners. It's like the destination point because the portrait of a graduate is looking at, are we making sure that students are critical thinkers? Are they, gaining skills in collaboration and adaptability? So you're really looking at competencies. And then on the other side, if we look at the blueprint for improved results for students with disabilities, which if you haven't seen it, it's on the NICEN website, okay? That's addressing the systems and conditions that make equitable access possible for our students. So we're looking at inclusion, we're looking at things like high expectations. But if you notice, the IEP is centered in the middle, okay? And that's because it operationalizes both, because it translates their goals into individualized supports, into services, into accommodations, and into specially designed instruction. So, because of this intersection, IEPs can't exist solely within the special ed department because their implementation depends on coordinated leadership. They have to ensure structures, resources, instructional alignment, and data systems in order to have IEPs carried out with fidelity. Now, here is where we look at core aspects of the IEP and how it relates to state reporting. Now, if we look at it through state performance plan indicators, right, we're looking at the purpose of the plan, which is to ensure that each state's implementation of the IEDEA under defined indicators, of which there are 17. All right. Now, the Office of Special Ed Programming sets the targets for each compliance indicator, and then each state, right, sets the targets for the results indicators like graduation rates, like dropout rates. So if we looked at the LRE, which is a part of the IEP, that's going to look at the least restrictive environment in which your students are being educated. So are your students in general ed settings for greater than 80% of the day or less than 40% of the day? Are they in separate settings like private schools, or are they out of district? So consider that as a principal, why would this interest you? Why would you want to know the least restrictive environment for your students?
Staffing,
Excuse me?
staffing reasons. Sorry.
Can you repeat yourself?
I'm sorry, for staffing
For
reasons.
staffing reasons, okay. What else?
Scheduling,
For
scheduling,
scheduling, okay.
knowing that my students are, that we look at inclusivity.
Mm-hmm. Why would you want to know the placements of your students who are out of district and in separate settings elsewhere? Why would that be of interest?
I think
Is it
for a variety of
compliant?
reasons. I mean, you look at, fiscally, right? That's a also, again, just making sure that, like, I mean, if you have a really high number of kids that are
Mm-hmm.
outside of your building, you, I hope, would start asking some questions as to why that was the case.
Absolutely, absolutely. So from a fiscal perspective, yes. Why are so many of my students out of district? And is there any way that I can bring them back? Do we need to make some adjustments in programming within district to bring them back? Because the numbers for students out of district, just from a financial perspective, are huge. All right. So if you can bring them back in, you can probably have more resources available from a financial aspect to be able to support your students.
Some good
Let's
answers up in the chat too.
Okay, to make sure the program is equitable, to maintain the standard.
IDEA accountability.
DEA, right, that so students are placed in the appropriate placement. Okay, all great answers. Thank you. Let's look at discipline. Okay, this indicator is looking at the percentage of your students with disabilities who are suspended or expelled for greater than 10 days. All right, they're also looking at significant discrepancies in the rate of suspensions and expulsions within racial or ethnic groups. So they're looking at disproportionality. So from an assistant principal perspective, know that your timelines and know the need for a manifestation determination review. Okay, and this is also, an area that needs to be monitored, because if you have students in an out-of-district setting like BOCES, and there are behavioral infractions, and those behavioral infractions that your students may be incurring in that setting that are requiring a suspension are all counting against your particular building. So it's also helpful to have conversations with the principal in that school, right, to say how is behavior being managed, and can we have some type of, coordination between that in order to try and reduce issues of accountability coming back on your building, but due to an out-of-district placement. Mhm. And also consider if you're sending students home without a formal process. Mhm. Now, graduation is indicator 1, and that's going to measure the percent of students that are graduating with a regular high school diploma, and they're looking at increasing the graduation rates, and also what is a comparison of that to the rest of the students in your population. Same thing with assessment. How many of your students are actually participating in assessments, looking at their proficiency rate against other students. And both of those actually are also reflective of your educational program, your academic program as a whole. And then if we look at transition planning, which is indicator 13, we're looking at planning for life after high school. Because remember, the purpose of IDEA is to prepare students for further education, employment, and independent living. And so transition kicks in at about age 16. It can kick in earlier, depending upon the unique needs, of a particular student. And the state can look at whether students have measurable post-secondary goals. Were they invited to their meetings? Did you have representatives from outside agencies like Access VR, which stands for Adult Career and Continuing Ed Services, Vocational Rehab? Do the goals for that student reflect their strengths and interests for post-secondary planning purposes? So from a principal's perspective, what kind of oversight would you have with regard to the transition planning process in your school? What do you see would be necessary for you to know and have available?
I think for some of our kids who go to like a CTE or a work-based learning, it's important to know what's out there and to help, facilitate and collaborate with, businesses so that you can try to get your kids into the workplace and give them some of those experiences so that they can prep for, post high school.
Excellent. Anything else with regard to courses?
Looking at your offerings, what you're going to offer in your, as part of your course catalog.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So are you offering opportunities that these students can avail themselves of so that that's going to assist them from a post-secondary planning standpoint? Are you having maybe guidance counselors participate in the CSE meetings for those students so they can also have input? I know at one point I was very fortunate to have been able to use some resources and hire a half-time transition coordinator from BOCES who met with my students and interacted with the parents and also outside agencies and job coaches and such to provide supports to students.
We are a District 75 program. We do have a transition coordinator working very closely with our families. One of the biggest push we have is just getting eligibility, going through the front door and getting services through OPWDD. Because without eligibility in OPWDD, when they do leave us, they're not going to have access to Access VR, supported employment, and it kind of limits their post-secondary placement at that point. So that's something that we work very closely with our families, and also to make sure that they have guardianship for those students that need it as well. So that's something that we'll look at in the IEPs.
Mm-hmm. Great. Where do you find the difficulties with regard to access with the OPWDDs? Because they lack staff?
It's a lengthy process to get to go through the front door. They want evaluations, etc. And sometimes a lot of the families just don't have the time or the understanding. So that's why our transition coordinator, especially, we start this push at age 14, because that's when we need to start making that plan in the IEP. But we hold their hand 18, 19, 20. Our school goes up to 22. So when they're leaving us, we want to make sure that they're all eligible and they all get the right services that they need. So, it's just, they just don't follow through. A lot of the families don't. I'm not going to say all of them. 90% of our families do, but we still have that 10% that does leave us, and then 2 years later come knocking on our door to our transition coordinator saying, please help me. My kid's been sitting home. I don't know what to do now.
Mm-hmm.
So we still have that small amount of families that are not following through, that we want to reach out to make sure that they leave us in the best possible outcome.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent, though, that you have that support available to provide that to parents on a, from a consistency standpoint. Because I know, breaking through any system is difficult, whether you're dealing with insurance companies or anything along those lines, you really need the support to be able to break through and get to the right people who can give you the support that you need and also do the follow through. So your students are fortunate that you have that support available. Mhm. Okay, so um, risk awareness with regard to the indicators, because there are risks involved. They could be mandatory corrective action plans. You could have state monitoring. You could have legal liability. So IEPs impact more than just what is happening in your building, right? Because we can't show the effectiveness of IDEA if we can't collect the data. And the data is going to come through the IEPs because the IEPs are going to feed into these indicators. So who oversees what? In order to determine that, you need to build the structural foundation. Remember, it takes a village for IEP implementation. And here's a sample. Just looking at a role clarity responsibility matrix. That's something that you can easily develop in district. You can look at all aspects of special ed. You can look at how it relates to implementing that IEP at the building level. And here are some, and here are some samples. I know it can be more difficult if you're in a smaller district where the principal may also wear multiple hats and be the CSE chair. Um, but here's a sample of what you could look at. You could look at the tasks like service delivery. Is the principal going to be responsible of that because they're at the building level and they see what's going on within their building and who's absent? They can walk around and see, our students where they need to be at any particular time. They can get input from their special ed staff and their gen ed staff as well. And maybe the secondary oversight would be the special ed director. And how often are you going to monitor that? You can determine that. Do you want to do it quarterly? Do you want to do it every 5 weeks during progress report time? Discipline generally goes to the assistant principal, and maybe secondary oversight would be the principal. And do you want to monitor that bi-monthly? What's our stats looking like? How many students have been suspended? Are we looking at students that had FBAs and behavior plans? What's the timeline? What have been our manifestation determination meetings over the past, 5 months? And just take each position in your district and see how you want to separate it out. Now, just looking at that matrix, does that look like something that would be possible in your district? Or do you have that already? There's another way to look at it, and that's also just developing a responsibility map. Maybe you don't have the dashboard in place with regard to determining frequency levels, but maybe you're just going to divide it up in this fashion, and you're not going to look at primary and secondary responsibility. Any thoughts along these lines?
I think it helps. We were lucky to work the budget to get an IEP coordinator. And we actually put out a posting this year for a transition coordinator and a job developer to help with the transition piece at the high school. And this year we've been implementing and structuring our teams in having one principal teacher from each PLC to be a part of that group to now roll it out to everybody and more on that teacher level. We're still in a pilot program of it, but it seems to be working where families are now more informed. Families are coming to the building to have our meetings, and we're supporting that IEP coordinator and transition coordinator together to work conjunctly at all the IEP meetings. So, we've had a little hiccups, but I think, advocating for that at their school has been really helpful so far in the past 3 months since we implemented it.
That's great that you were able to get that through, your resources in district.
Yeah, Joanne, I just have to add that it's
Sure.
good to look at these slides because the simple act of spelling it out, who's responsible for what in this district, I think it's surprisingly rare. But I think it's very necessary and very appreciated given how much time everybody spends figuring out whose job what is, whose
Mm.
job. Okay. And so these couple of slides are very helpful. It's not the same in every district, right?
Right.
Roles are not the same in every district. Everyone who's listening, has would make up maybe charts that are different from this in some way.
Mhm.
The assistant principal doesn't always handle discipline in every district, all kinds of
Sure.
permutations of this. But the point is, having something like this that exists and is shared and is accessible is really a good thing to have. It's good to have for parents too, sometimes, and just for clarity in terms of roles. Whose primarily responsibility is it? Whose secondary responsibility is it? And then there's the larger picture that extends out from there. But I just think it's helpful. And I was just kind of thinking, um, I don't know, everyone, feel free to chime in, but I don't know how common it is in districts to have charts and documents like this that people actually see that help everyone understand roles and responsibilities. So it's something good to think about.
Mm. Absolutely, Karen. And I think once responsibilities are assigned, I think it behooves the administrative cabinet to develop a plan for maintaining accountability. All right. So that's why a cross-department accountability meeting can be held, every 5 to 10 weeks. You can do that at your administrative cabinet meetings, or at least do it quarterly. And on your agenda, put down, are there been
Okay.
many missed services this month? Have there been any staffing changes that are impacting students? Do we have issues with regard to technology access? What are the state reporting updates? Is there anything that we need to look at? Are there any due process concerns? And basically, what you're doing is just keeping the issues of special ed front and center. And you're really having a sense of getting the input from all of the other leaders and what their responsibilities are and if there are any particular concerns. And just tack it on to your agenda. Now, what IEP structural protection looks like, it looks like having a clear workflow. It looks like acknowledgement of responsibilities. It looks like a written monitoring cycle. It looks like an observable reporting chain. And the end result of that should be compliance. All right. Now, creating a structural foundation, I think, is vital because there's always the chance of cross-district legal risk, in terms of like wide discrepancies of how circumstances are managed. I mean, let's face it, parents talk, they talk in the supermarket, they talk on the soccer field, it's through social media, right? So it helps if leadership has a solid understanding of issues and how best to manage them so that we make sure that we have some accountability across the district. Now, in addition, the other issue, and I think it piggybacks somewhat on what Karen had mentioned, is that governance can collapse when leadership changes. I heard at another conference that 1 in 4 principals and 22% of special ed directors change every year. So having the foundation in place really provides you with a supportive base for continuity of practice and procedures. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take what we've reviewed and we're going to apply it to an active case. And we'll review as many aspects, in the case as we can. So as you hear about the complaint, I want you to start reflecting not only on your own role, but also where other roles would intersect from a structural model, legal, operational, and instructional. All right. So here we have an active lawsuit that was filed last year. So we have it's Simmons versus Edmond School District. And McCain is classified as a student with an intellectual disability, a reported IQ of 67. She has ADHD. She has dyslexia. So reading disability, she has dyscalculia, which would be her math disability, and she has dysgraphia, which would be her writing disability. She graduated from Linwood High School in 2022 with a 3.87 GPA. However, she is reportedly reading at a first grade level and she's unable to perform basic math skills. So I just want you to sit with that for a minute. Now, the lawsuit, these are the claims that were filed against the district. The lawsuit alleges educational malpractice. Okay. It also alleges benevolent discrimination. And I have to say, that was a new term for me. So it's actually a form of prejudice that treats a person as less than capable. That's the, elementary version of it. But they do it through the lens of being kind and caring, hence the standard diploma. Failure to provide meaningful access to education, and improper awarding of a standard diploma, given that the student graduated without meeting the state learning standards. Now, the issue was, did the school district fail to provide FAPE? And did the district act unlawfully in granting a diploma to a student who did not meet the necessary standards, which terminated her access to transition services? So the post-graduation impact was that parents are now paying in excess of $43,000 per year in a similar life skills program as the one the district has, and she could have attended that program for free. Mhm. Now, I just want to add a disclaimer here in that while we don't have McKenna's full academic history and we're not attorneys offering legal advice, that this case really just provides us with an opportunity to reflect on how the decisions and the systems led by school administrators can really intersect with situations that ultimately lead to legal challenges that shape outcomes, for our students. So just having this information, what do you think should have been the early warning indicators that school leaders should have identified regarding her progress?
Well, if she was taking state exams or any type of summative or even formative assessments, it should have been clear there that she, was not at a grade level for ELA or math. So
Mm-hmm.
that should have been a red flag.
Okay, good. Any others?
Her progress monitoring all along should have sort of been a bit of a concern
You would think.
if
Okay,
it,
any
if it
others?
existed in the first place, I guess.
Right.
Right,
If there's no
right.
progress made, no progress made year after year on these annuals, that's a red flag as to what's happening with instruction.
Mm-hmm.
The
Anything else?
psychological evaluation that was conducted should have been taken into account during the IEP, especially with her IQ being at a 67. I think one of my other questions that I have with this scenario is, the parents are paying $43,000 per year for a similar life skills program. But did they require the district to pay for it because their daughter wasn't provided FAPE correctly?
Okay, so that's something that's going to come out in the outcome. That's what they're alleging. Okay, in their lawsuit, and understanding when I was checking the lawsuit out, that's $43,000 plus. Okay, it's not the total amount of the program, but that's what they're alleging, and that's what they're looking to achieve. I'm sure is financial remuneration for the program that she's attending. But it'll be interesting to see how this lawsuit plays out. All right, because it's an active one. So
I,
any further information about it is not on the district, is not out actually, online. So
I
any
also,
other thoughts? Go ahead.
sorry, yeah, I also had another thought as
Mhm.
were they just rubber stamping her goals for her IEP throughout the years? Because um if she made it all that way, right? And if we're progress monitoring, then how could her goals have been moving and they still, every year passed her along?
Mm-hmm. Right. Those are all excellent questions. What do you think that GPA says to a parent?
She's a brainiac.
She knows how to read and write, and those math skills are
Mm-hmm.
existent.
Right, right. And I had a secondary thought when I was looking at this and maybe wondering, and this is, thinking outside the box, um, wondering why they didn't have her go to the district's program. So if financially there were issues, within the district, was there a possibility that maybe they had students that had other skills that were at a slightly higher level, and they were trying to weigh out which students to actually enroll in their program?
I have one
So,
other question.
um,
Is there a date when this came out? I don't remember hearing you say that earlier.
This was filed in 25. She graduated in 2022
Okay,
from high
so she
school.
would have been a COVID kid. So yes, she would have got the excuse for the Regents examination. So they would all have been rubber stamped there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, okay.
so my question that I would really like to ask is who was monitoring the instruction within the school? Because as a former principal, a key role of the principal is an instructional leader. And if students are allowed to walk away with GPA of 3 point plus and they can't read and write, there is a serious instructional lapse within the school.
Mm-hmm. And considering her disability as well. So you're all raising some, very important and very, descriptive concerns. So let's just look at this as a basic. She had a high GPA with very low academic assessments. She had lack of academic growth over multiple years. She had repeated unmet IEP goals. She had minimal literacy and math progress. There was weak progress monitoring, and the parent was not fully informed, okay, of her transition options. Right? So let's think about operationally, where did this system break down in the case? All right. Did it break down from a legal level, including the IEP procedural and content failures? Did it break down on an operational level, or did it break down on an instructional level? And so things to consider would be, were there administrative oversight gaps? Were there systemic failures? What could have been prevention strategies? And Todd, you're saying all three. And I think Michaela says, I would not trust the district after this experience. And I hear you. Okay, so let's look at the legal compliance, considerations. And, we did previously review some legal issues, but was the student receiving FAPE? Did the school ensure that she received an education that helped her make meaningful progress? Were IEP goals aligned with meaningful progress? Were there a lack of updates? Were parents informed that accepting a standard diploma terminates IDEA services? And were transition services implemented effectively? So just looking at this, do you think maybe there were more process issues or content issues? Or do you think maybe it was a mix of both? Okay, process, okay.
I think it's process. It could be both, but what is the process and what is the protocols that were followed and or lack of, and especially when it comes to that progress monitoring in this particular scenario.
Okay. And content areas is where we're looking at, her IEP. Okay.
Joanne, I wonder, somebody mentioned, she was a student during COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that would have a major impact on this case one way or other in terms of actual delivery of services?
That's an interesting question. I think it's also looking at her, her disability and where her skill levels were and were they, certainly further impacted during that period of time. Like they were for, I think, many other students.
As a special ed teacher that taught through that whole COVID period and
Mm-hmm.
working with students in the virtual setting, and trying to progress monitor goals, I know the state gave a statement that we could put into the IEP goals stating, and I forget what the one sentence statement was, but it ensured it covered the teacher and the district regarding the goal because the student couldn't be adequately monitored because they were sitting in a virtual setting. However, and I did a PD for this for the district when I was there. I went outside the box. So I said, if I'm going to progress monitor a goal, I'm not putting in a generic statement to just to cover myself. If I want to be able to see the growth, whether it's in the virtual setting or it's in person. So it's a program that the district had. It was called Ed Puzzle. And I could actually take a video and implement it into Edpuzzle, and I could actually drill it down to monitor specifically a goal that a student had within the IEP. So all of the students on my caseload, I was able to make individual videos to target each individual goal for each student to be able to adequately progress monitor that goal. And then I had the data from the Ed Puzzle that I could archive. So I had the information should down the road I need to justify my notes within the IEP.
That is awesome. I haven't heard of that. Can you put that in the chat?
Certainly.
Sure.
The name of the program?
The name of the
Edpuzzle?
program. Absolutely. Thank you so much for filling us in on that because I hadn't heard of that. So let's look at this from a principal AP perspective. Okay, the warning signs for the principal should have been what?
The warning signs for the principal should have been looking at these the CSIS reports and the no progress made.
Right.
So
So
following up with the teachers on probably no evidence, which is probably the issue with the case, right? With this actual case, that if the school cannot present any evidence as to what the work is.
well, we don't know about that piece yet, but what we do know from a principal AP perspective and being the instructional leader of a building is that she had a high GPA but low reading and math assessments. So maybe they could have flagged something for you as a principal and the instructional leader. Maybe the student progressing through grades without skill growth. If you're looking at your student's performance, maybe that would have flagged something for you at that time.
And if you're involved in any sort of like meetings with your staff, you would think, right, that like this would be a student that they would have brought to, child study team or, something, right? I mean,
along the lines, right? And actually followed it over the years.
What is the
Now,
policy on a GPA as related to IEP? This cannot be related to IEP goals. I mean, how does she get that GPA?
That's a question to ask. Absolutely. All right. So what actions could you take? So for example, maybe, you're finding that if this is coming up, then you're looking at, well, maybe I need to review progress data for high profile students with disabilities, and do that during a leadership data meeting. Or maybe, I need to ask my special ed staff, is this student gaining foundational literacy and math skills? Are there any other questions, any other actions that you think you could take?
I would say walk through information and walk through data should be, instruction should be actually actively and frequently monitored.
Okay. And Todd says check curriculum alignment. Yes. Anything else?
If you had, I guess, a compliance officer or someone to just review IEPs, versus grades, coursework, progress monitoring, things of that nature.
Okay. All right. All excellent actions to take when something like this comes up and finding out, do your teachers understand the process? Thank you, Todd. All
how
right.
about parents, right? Like, I think that's that's a whole big piece of this that could,
So should you be having conversations with parents? with regard to situations such as this, rather than waiting for them to come up at a CSE meeting. All right. Another, and from a principal perspective, you can look at and say, do our grades reflect, actual learning for students with disabilities? Like, is this student receiving enough time and support, to build essential academic skills? All right. Now, let's say you happen to be the director of special ed. What would have been a warning sign for you here?
Certainly the progress monitoring data that we would want to be looking at, or maybe that goals were not not achieved, or I think just like a big old hole with some of that data.
So were IEP goals like they were repeating year after year?
Right. And even like her, a real hard look at some of her, like her standardized assessments, if you're looking at, and like her cognitives and looking at, oh, wow, the ADHD. So executive function process and, all of the things. I feel like there would be some definite, like, I don't know, things that I would want to dig a little deeper into.
Yes,
Sure.
and comparing that to, let's say, her triannuals, depending on how long she's had this IEP, if cognitively she's not there according to these tests, how can she be pulling a 3.78 GPA?
Okay. So actions you could take would be to what? Even if we just looked at the goals piece, what would you do in terms of actions with your staff?
I would work backwards, because if I saw that GPA and this student was receiving instruction that seemed to be more difficult than what might be achieved for someone who has her IQ, I would wonder, well, is this student classified properly? So I would work the other way. I would
Well,
wonder if,
go ahead.
I'm just saying,
Yeah.
you would have to, how is the student making these achievements, knowing that they have the IQ that they have, and also are they classified properly? Was an error made in their IQ testing? Because also during COVID, a lot of the school psychs were not doing new reevals either.
Well, I think understanding the length of time that the student has been in the system, she was deaf, she was identified as an intellectual disability prior to COVID. Okay. This wasn't anything that happened just during the time of COVID where she was identified. She had had this identification prior to. So I think, you raised, an important point as to when students are classified, but I think she has a history of being classified as a student with an intellectual disability. But I think if you're, a special ed director, one of the things you want to make sure is you want to make sure that IEP goals and that your staff is aware that those goals, yes, they have to be appropriately ambitious, they have to be measurable, but you also have to be looking at, are they attainable, within like a year's time frame. And if progress monitoring is showing that a student is not attaining those goals, then that becomes definitely a point of concern. All right. So let's look at our director of curriculum instruction. Where should they have kind of like been alerted with regard to this student, and what actions should they have taken?
Maybe looking at the data, or end of unit data, and along with what they're teaching, aligned to her getting that particular GPA. That just really analyzing the data that the teachers take is, I think, for me, where I would start to.
Okay, and Todd is saying, yeah, a deeper examination of the progress monitoring data, and especially when would the child, first stop not meeting their goals. So definitely, yes, looking at students who are showing very low reading and math ability despite, multiple years in school, Is the student receiving like evidence-based literacy instruction? Do the teachers need specific training? So that's all areas to look at. And actions that you can take would be along those specific areas. If the grades aren't conveying useful and concrete information, then, that's something you need to take a look at. You want to make sure that the teachers are being trained in like foundational reading and math skills, so that all comes down to curriculum. Any other thoughts for our director of curriculum instruction? Okay. Evelyn says looking at report card data and related class performance. Okay. And Emily, if the curriculum is being modified to get the high GPA. Okay.
I think also from a leadership perspective, it's really important to make sure that your whatever person is in charge of the progress monitoring knows the difference between quantitative and qualitative data, and that you must be able to, like actually produce said data, and it must be, you must have some sort of actual, if it didn't, right? If you don't have it, can't produce it, it didn't happen.
Right.
So, really making sure that you are clear on what you do collect and how we do collect student data for progress monitoring purposes. Because a lot of like we run into this here, it's been a huge it's been a huge thing because it used to be they would say just like teacher observation. And I'm like, but that's not like, so what are you using? Fine, but like you have to have something to quantify that. So is it a checklist? Is it a, is it a time on task? Like you have to have something. You have to be able to produce whatever that is. Because if you're sitting in a meeting and an attorney or or a parent or someone says, show me the data, then you ought to and must be able to produce it, or else you basically, it doesn't exist.
Right. Right. Excellent, excellent. Yeah, the issue about teacher observation, comes up, and then it becomes like which teacher and what are they using, with regards to, formulating an opinion about a student, and then that's going to change from one teacher or another. So that's why the hard data is necessary, because then you could have conversations about that from what happened in, February to how's the student progressing in March, where do we need to, adjust the goals and objectives, but without that hard data, it makes it difficult.
In a bigger way, it really exposes the problems with traditional grading systems, with teacher created grading systems. We think, how could this be? How could this happen? We have things in place, rock hard in some traditional grading systems that where this actually could happen, and it did. So even the bigger picture that it exposes for students without disabilities in terms of the ultimate failure, meaninglessness of traditional grading systems is huge.
Right, right. And, like everything else, an A in one teacher's class is not an A in another. Progress monitoring, in one class may be very difficult than what's happening in another. So I think, like Todd says, the district needs to do a systems review of grading. Should they move to standards-based grading? And you're right. You made that comment about saying that they're a good kid. When I was reading further into the case, the mother would say, I'm sitting at a CSE meeting and I'm just trying to get information, my daughter, and they say, she's very sweet. She gets along, with everyone. She's a pleasure, to have in class, basically.
A
But
compliance grade.
right, right. So I think that's definitely, a concern. Now, if we're looking at the director of data and technology, I don't know if there are any concerns there. My thought was, given the data points that were stated, maybe why didn't that show up in their system, or did it? Maybe should we flag students are having much more significant difficulty? You know, um, is there something that we can do so that we can show those discrepancies and have a better look at it? You know, any other thoughts with regard to data? Okay, does the district have a systematic process to review data with a multidisciplinary team? Todd, you're raising excellent points here. And it truly will be interesting to see how this plays out. And now we have the school business official, you know. So any warning signs there? What should the school business official be thinking about?
All things from a money perspective and the services that have been provided and, related services, all the things.
Right. Like, is the money being spent appropriately? Are students needing intensive support, but maybe we have limited resources? You know, are our transition or vocational programs underfunded? So maybe again, the district had a transition program, but maybe they had limitations on how many students could attend the program. And then, the issue becoming whether, financial decisions are limiting access to necessary support. So do we have enough reading and math intervention specialists? Can we expand the transition program? Can we have more vocational experiences for students? And the bottom line, are we allocating our resources to the programs that most impact our students' skill development? And I had another thought. Was there a graduation readiness review? So before terminating her opportunities under IDEA, did the leadership team meet? Did they determine, does she demonstrate basic literacy and numeracy skills? Is she prepared for further education, employment, or independent living? Or would additional transition services be beneficial for her before graduation? So I think from a systems perspective, and if we're looking at a systems lesson for school leaders, this lawsuit likely didn't occur because of one decision, but it occurred because there were several missed opportunities over the years. And that included, instructional oversight, data review, IEP goal monitoring, maybe transition planning, possible, budgetary concerns impacting staffing and programming, and definitely, conversations about graduation readiness. So, reflecting, if someone asked each administrator in your district, what is your responsibility regarding IEPs? Would their answers be clear? Would they be consistent? Would they be aligned? Because if not, then the structure needs strengthening, because every IEP is a student counting on the adults in the system to get it right. And I just added some resources. The first was the lawsuit. The second is, if you're not familiar with the Part 200 regulations of the commissioner, to note that on the NYSED website, because that's going to give you the procedural issues, and also note the Part 200 because that's pertaining to discipline. And then there's also the blueprint for improved results for students with disabilities. That is an excellent resource. And if you haven't accessed the IRIS website, that's an excellent website for obtaining information on special education for your districts.
Joanne, we can't thank you enough. The time went quickly, but we brought it right in. And we learned so much. We really appreciate everything that you shared with us today. And we also appreciate our listeners because there was just such really good
thank you for that. Yeah.
Great questions, great feedback, really terrific. So thank you again, Joanne, for another terrific workshop. And remember